Picture this: a handful of knights, bound by vows of poverty and prayer, setting out with nothing but faith and steel to protect travelers on dangerous roads. Within a few short decades, these same men would command castles, control vast wealth, and shape the destiny of kingdoms. The Knights Templar emerged from obscurity to become one of the most influential forces of the medieval world. A story so extraordinary it almost feels like legend. Yet every twist of their fate was shaped by human choices, moments where a different decision might have led to a completely different history. Their rise was as breathtaking as their fall was sudden, leaving behind mysteries that captivate us centuries later. What if I told you that the very foundations of modern banking, international diplomacy, and even concepts of cross-border cooperation can be traced back to these warrior monks? The Templars didn't just fight battles, they built systems, made alliances, took risks, and sometimes made costly errors. Their decisions reached far beyond the battlefields of the Holy Land, affecting economics, culture, and politics in ways that still echo in our world today. This isn't just a story about knights in shining armor. It's a story about power, strategy, and the delicate balance between ideals and ambition. In this video, we're going to walk through the 25 most pivotal decisions the Templars ever made, choices that redirected the flow of medieval history. We'll explore how a small order of monks transformed into financiers of kings, how they won papal favor only to incite royal jealousy, and why their greatest strengths eventually became their most fatal weaknesses. You'll see how their legacy isn't confined to history books. It lives on in architecture, symbolism, and even some of the conspiracy theories that continue to spark our imagination. So settle in and join me on this journey back in time, because the story of the Templars is more than a tale of faith and violence. It's a lesson in how vision, power, and human nature can alter the world forever. To truly grasp the magnitude of the Templars' impact, we need to step into the chaotic world that made their existence not just remarkable, but almost necessary. The year is 1119, and the First Crusade has, against all odds, succeeded in capturing Jerusalem, but the victory is fragile. The roads to the Holy City are perilous, stalked by bandits and rival factions. Pilgrims, ordinary men and women armed with little more than faith, undertake the treacherous journey from Europe, only to be robbed, kidnapped, or killed within sight of their destination. Into this void of authority and safety stepped a small band of knights, seemingly too few to make a difference. Their leader was a French nobleman from Champagne, Hugues de Payens. Along with 8 companions, mostly relatives or close allies, he proposed a radical new mission. They would become the first warrior monks, taking the traditional vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but with a crucial addition: a vow to protect. They called themselves the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, a name derived from their new headquarters on the Temple Mount, believed to be the ruins of King Solomon's temple. Initially, their resources were as humble as their name suggests. Contemporary accounts describe them as so poor they often had to share a single horse between 2 knights, an image that would later become a powerful part of their symbolic seal. For nearly a decade, these 9 knights operated in obscurity, their noble goal overshadowed by the sheer scale of the problem. Their breakthrough came through a powerful alliance. Hugues de Payens traveled to the west and found a formidable patron in Bernard of Clairvaux, a leading churchman and intellectual powerhouse. Bernard was captivated by this new model of spiritual knighthood. He saw in them the perfect fusion of the 2 highest callings of the time: the monk who prays and the knight who fights. In a sweeping document of praise and promotion called In Praise of the New Knighthood, Bernard championed their cause to the Pope and the nobility of Europe. His endorsement was like a royal seal of approval, transforming the Templars from an obscure local guard into a cause célèbre. This led directly to their formal recognition at the Council of Troyes in 1129, where they were given an official rule, largely based on the strict Cistercian code Bernard followed. This official birth certificate, blessed by the Church, was the first truly pivotal enabler for everything that followed. It gave them structure, legitimacy, and a flood of new recruits and donations from inspired nobles. This humble beginning, born from a practical need to protect the vulnerable, contained the seeds of their future empire. They were no longer just 9 men with a shared horse. They were an idea, an institution, and they were ready to change the world. This was no simple rebranding exercise. The Templars' decision to fuse the life of a cloistered monk with that of a bloodied knight was a radical, almost heretical innovation that fundamentally altered the medieval world's understanding of both vocations. Before their arrival, the Church had long wrestled with the concept of the warrior, often viewing violence as a necessary evil at best and a sinful path at worst. The concept of a holy warrior existed, but the Templars institutionalized it, creating a disciplined, permanent force where every action, from prayer to combat, was framed as an act of devotion. They didn't just fight and then pray for forgiveness. They fought as their prayer, their swords serving as extensions of their faith. This required a complete overhaul of the typical knight's lifestyle. They adopted the strict Cistercian rule, which meant a life of austerity, simple meals eaten in silence, rough woolen habits instead of fine linens, and nights spent in common dormitories rather than private chambers. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, renouncing personal wealth and family ties to dedicate themselves entirely to the order's mission. This asceticism was their spiritual armor, proving their motives were pure and divine, not grounded in earthly desire for glory or plunder. The genius of this dual identity was how it resonated with every level of medieval society. For the Church, they were the perfect answer to a theological dilemma: how to reclaim the Holy Land without condoning the wanton violence and greed that often characterized the early Crusades. Here were men who submitted to ecclesiastical authority, lived in poverty, and whose warfare could be framed as not just sanctioned but sacred. For the nobility of Europe, the Templars offered a new and highly prestigious outlet for younger sons who stood to inherit no land. Instead of causing trouble at home or embarking on uncertain mercenary work, they could now take vows and gain honor, purpose, and the chance for glory in God's name, all while their family earned spiritual merit by donating to the cause. For the common people, they were heroic figures, living saints in armor who protected the vulnerable pilgrim. This powerful appeal triggered an avalanche of support. Donations of land, money, and precious relics flooded in from kings and nobles seeking to secure their place in heaven. Younger sons from good families clamored to join, creating a constant stream of highly trained, well-connected recruits. This convergence of spiritual and military power created something entirely new: a standing army loyal to the Pope and funded by international donations that could be deployed across Christendom. Unlike a feudal levy that would disband after 40 days of service, the Templars were always there, a permanent fixture in the defense of the Crusader states. Their network of commanderies and preceptories across Europe acted not just as estates but as recruiting centers, training grounds, and logistical hubs, funneling men, money, and material to the front lines in the East. This model was so effective it was immediately copied. The Hospitallers, who began as caregivers for the sick, soon adopted a similar military function, and new orders like the Teutonic Knights were founded directly on the Templar blueprint. By successfully embodying this paradox of the monk warrior, the Templars didn't just create an order, they created an archetype that would define the crusading movement for centuries, proving that faith, when combined with formidable organization and martial skill, could become one of the most powerful forces on the medieval battlefield. But with this newfound influence and a rapidly expanding network of properties across Europe, the Templars soon faced a critical challenge. Their unique status as international monks and warriors meant they were operating within the territories of kings and under the jurisdiction of local bishops, all of whom expected some form of control or tribute. A French baron might donate a valuable vineyard, but then the local bishop could demand a cut of its profits, or a king might insist the knights from that region answer his call to arms, not the orders. This tangled web of feudal and ecclesiastical obligations threatened to strangle their growth and dilute their mission. They needed a higher authority to cut them free. Their solution was as brilliant as it was audacious. They went straight to the top. In 1139, just a decade after their official recognition, the Templars secured a document from Pope Innocent II that would become the bedrock of their power, the papal bull known as Omni-Datum Optimum, Latin for every good gift. This was far more than a simple letter of praise. It was a revolutionary charter of independence that fundamentally reshaped their relationship with the entire medieval power structure. With this single document, the Pope placed the order and all its possessions under the direct and sole protection of the Holy See. They were now answerable only to the Pope himself, a figure thousands of miles away in Rome, and completely exempt from the authority of any local bishop, archbishop, or secular ruler. Imagine a modern multinational corporation that could ignore the laws of every country it operated in, paying no taxes and following only the directives of a single international body. That was the level of autonomy the Templars had just been granted. The privileges detailed in the bull were staggering. They were given the right to build their own churches and oratories, effectively creating their own private parish network. They could collect tithes, the 10% tax on agricultural production that was the lifeblood of the local church, and keep every penny for themselves, diverting funds that would have otherwise supported the diocesan clergy. Most crucially, they were granted exemption from all tithes and taxes owed to other ecclesiastical authorities. This financial immunity meant that wealth flowing into their coffers would never flow out, allowing them to accumulate capital on an unprecedented scale. The immediate impact was transformative. This papal shield supercharged their ability to operate across borders with a consistency and efficiency that was unimaginable for any other contemporary institution. A Templar traveling from London to Jerusalem could move through the lands of warring kings and feuding bishops, yet he remained under a single, unified legal system, their own rule. Their properties became extraterritorial islands, sovereign Templar soil within the heart of France, England, or Aragon. This autonomy was the key that unlocked their potential as Europe's first truly international organization. It allowed them to standardize their banking operations, ensuring a letter of credit issued in Paris would be honored in Acre without question. It gave their officials the diplomatic immunity needed to transport treasure or negotiate treaties between monarchs without fear of being detained or robbed. For a century, this special status made them the ultimate insiders, the power behind the thrones, trusted precisely because they were beholden to no single throne. Yet, this very independence planted the poisonous seeds of their eventual destruction. By placing themselves above local power structures, they made powerful enemies. Kings and bishops watched with growing resentment as these warrior monks grew wealthier and more powerful, flaunting their privileges and ignoring royal decrees. The stage was set for a catastrophic clash between the Order's papal privileges and the rising tide of royal authority, a conflict that would one day lead to a dawn raid on a Friday the 13th. While their military might was formidable, the Templars' most enduring legacy might just be the one they built not with swords but with ledgers and seals. They looked at the chaotic landscape of medieval travel and saw a problem ripe for a solution. A nobleman yearning to join a crusade or a pilgrim seeking salvation in Jerusalem faced a terrifying practical dilemma: how to fund their journey. Traveling with a chest of gold coins was an open invitation to be robbed and left for dead on some foreign roadside. The Templars, with their sprawling network of fortified preceptories stretching from England to the Holy Land, realized they were uniquely positioned to solve this. They didn't just offer protection for the body, they offered protection for the purse. A traveler could deposit their entire fortune at a local Templar commandery in, say, Paris. In exchange, they received a meticulously coded letter of credit, a piece of parchment that was essentially worthless to anyone but them and the Order. They could then travel unburdened by wealth, their journey safer without the weight of coin. Upon reaching a Templar house in Acre or Jerusalem, they would present their letter and withdraw the equivalent value in local currency, minus a modest fee for the service. This system was nothing short of a financial revolution. It was the birth of the checking account, the wire transfer, and the traveler's check, all rolled into one ingenious package. But the Templars' financial acumen went far beyond simple money changing for pilgrims. Their network evolved into the most sophisticated and trusted banking institution of the Middle Ages, becoming the treasurers and lenders to the most powerful figures in Europe. Kings like Louis IX of France and Henry III of England didn't just use the Templars as a convenient vault, they entrusted them with their entire royal treasuries. The Paris Temple became the central bank of France, its formidable fortress housing the crown jewels and the state's coffers. The Templars managed papal finances, collecting tithes and donations from across Christendom and funneling them to Rome. They provided loans to fund wars, dowries for princesses, and even bailouts for cash-strapped monarchs. Their financial power was built on an unshakable foundation of trust and security. A Templar preceptory was one of the most secure places on earth, its defenses often surpassing those of a royal castle. Their reputation for honesty was legendary. A deposit with the Templars was considered absolutely safe. This trust allowed them to accumulate enormous liquid capital, which they then leveraged to fund their own massive military expenditures in the Holy Land, building castles like Atlet and financing entire campaigns without having to constantly beg for donations. This decision to become the world's first international bankers fundamentally altered the Templars' role in medieval society. They were no longer just warrior monks, they were financiers, accountants, and power brokers. Their economic tentacles reached into every royal court, making them indispensable to the functioning of European politics and commerce. However, this immense financial influence created a dangerous dependency and ultimately a terrifying vulnerability. By becoming the bankers to kings, they became the holders of those kings' deepest secrets and greatest debts. They knew which monarchs were solvent and which were teetering on bankruptcy. This knowledge was power, but it was also a poison. When a king like Philip IV of France found himself drowning in debt, much of it owed to the Templars, he didn't see his bankers as holy warriors. He saw them as creditors and, worse, as a state within a state that held far too much power over his kingdom. The very financial network that had made the Order so powerful and indispensable also painted the ultimate target on its back, proving that in the Game of Thrones, being the bank can be just as dangerous as being the king. While their financial and diplomatic maneuvers secured their power in Europe, the Templars knew that true influence in the Holy Land was measured not in coin, but in control of the ground beneath their feet. The vast, arid landscapes of Outremer were a constant strategic puzzle, where a single mountain pass or a coastal landing point could mean the difference between a secure supply line and a disastrous ambush. Recognizing this, the Order made a monumental and costly strategic choice to become the master builders of the Crusader states, pouring a staggering portion of their vast wealth into the construction and maintenance of an unbreakable chain of fortresses. This was not about vanity or simple defense. It was a calculated doctrine of power projection. They identified key choke points, narrow coastal plains, critical river crossings, and mountain passes that served as invasion highways, and proceeded to crown them with some of the most advanced military architecture the world had ever seen. Take the great sea castle of Atlet, known to the Templars as Chateau Pèlerin or Pilgrim's Castle. Built on a peninsula jutting into the Mediterranean, it was a masterpiece of defensive thinking. Its massive walls, some over 50 feet thick, were built from the local sandstone, making them nearly impervious to the siege engines of the age. It featured its own freshwater supply from an inner well, a deep-water harbor for receiving supplies and reinforcements directly from Europe, and enough land within its walls to sustain a large garrison for months. Atlet wasn't just a castle, it was a self-sufficient fortress city, a statement in stone that declared the Templar presence was permanent. Similarly, the fortress at Tortosa guarded a vital port city, its formidable keep serving as the last bastion of Crusader defense in the region long after the town itself had fallen. And high in the hills of Galilee, the castle of Safed dominated the surrounding countryside, its strategic position allowing the Templars to control movement between the Mediterranean coast and the interior, and to threaten any Muslim force operating in the area. The genius of this fortification strategy was its economy of force. Rather than trying to maintain a massive, expensive, and hard-to-supply field army that could be lured into traps or defeated in a single decisive battle, the Templars opted for a network of static strongpoints. A relatively small number of highly disciplined knights and sergeants could garrison these castles, effectively controlling vast swaths of territory simply by their threatening presence. From these secure bases, they could launch patrols, raid enemy supply caravans, and provide a safe haven for Christian settlers and traders. Their castles became the anchors of the entire Crusader defensive system, symbols of unyielding resilience that often deterred attack through reputation alone. A Muslim army would have to think twice before advancing deep into Templar-controlled territory, knowing that these formidable garrisons could sally forth to attack their rear or cut their supply lines. Yet, for all its strengths, this grand strategy came with a profound and ultimately crippling downside. The construction of these stone giants was phenomenally expensive, consuming fortunes that could have been used to hire mercenaries, bribe local emirs, or fund more flexible military campaigns. Once built, they demanded constant investment. Garrisons had to be paid and fed, walls maintained and upgraded against new siege technology, and stores of weapons and food perpetually replenished. This created a tremendous fixed cost, tying down a huge portion of the Order's manpower and financial resources in static defense. As the military situation in the Holy Land grew more desperate in the late 13th century, this lack of strategic flexibility became a fatal weakness. The Mamluks, under commanders like Baybars, became experts at bypassing these great fortresses, picking off weaker towns and cutting them off from each other, effectively neutralizing their power without ever having to storm their walls. The Templars were like a player who had bet everything on building an impregnable king in a game of chess, only to watch their opponent skillfully take control of the entire board around them. Their mighty castles, testaments to their engineering genius and unwavering resolve, ultimately became magnificent, expensive cages, holding the last of their strength while the world they were built to defend crumbled around them. This culture of secrecy was not born out of a love for mystery, but from stark, practical necessity. Operating in a world of shifting alliances, espionage, and constant military threat, the Templars understood that loose lips didn't just sink ships, they could topple kingdoms and get their brothers killed. Their entire operation, from the intricate details of their banking transactions to the timing of their military campaigns, relied on information being tightly controlled. A rumor about a shipment of gold could attract bandits. A leaked battle plan could lead an entire contingent into an ambush. To mitigate this, they built a wall of silence around their inner workings, governed by a rule that prescribed severe punishments for gossips and traitors. A knight who revealed the order's secrets, whether about its finances or its initiation rites, faced harsh penalties, including imprisonment, expulsion, or worse. This created an environment where trust was absolute and confidentiality was second nature, allowing them to coordinate complex operations across thousands of miles with remarkable efficiency. A Templar commander in Jerusalem could send a coded message to a preceptor in France, confident that its contents would remain secure from prying eyes. This operational security was a tremendous force multiplier, making them a far more formidable and cohesive organization than any of their rivals. This internal discipline extended far beyond just keeping secrets. It was the very glue that held their multinational enterprise together. Their hierarchy was rigid and unquestionable, a military chain of command fused with monastic obedience. At the top sat the Grand Master, an elected leader whose authority was absolute. Below him were the regional masters, commanders of individual castles, and sergeants, each knowing their precise place and duty. This structure ensured that orders from the top were executed immediately and without debate, a critical advantage in the chaos of battle where hesitation meant death. A Templar knight did not question a command to charge into a numerically superior force. He lowered his lance and obeyed. This blind obedience, born from years of discipline and spiritual conditioning, made their charges terrifyingly effective and their defensive stands legendary. It created a brotherhood where personal ambition was subsumed by the collective goal, fostering a unity that transcended the usual national and linguistic barriers that divided other Crusader forces. A French knight and a Spanish sergeant, who might otherwise be rivals, were bound together as brothers of the Temple, answering to the same rule and the same God. However, this very strength, their impenetrable unity and silence, slowly curdled into a profound weakness in the court of public opinion. To the outside world, this closed-off nature began to look less like prudent security and more like arrogant exclusivity. Their refusal to discuss their rituals or disclose their wealth made them appear shadowy and suspicious. Why would God's holy warriors need such secrecy unless they had something to hide? This aura of mystery became a blank canvas onto which their enemies could project every manner of dark fantasy. Whispers began to circulate in the taverns and courts of Europe. Perhaps their initiation ceremonies involved denying Christ or spitting on the cross to prove their loyalty wasn't to faith, but to the order itself. Maybe their incredible wealth wasn't from donations, but from ungodly practices like alchemy or even witchcraft. Their financial success, combined with their silence, led to accusations of greed and corruption. The fact that they only answered to the Pope made kings and bishops, who were already resentful of their privileges, even more eager to believe the worst. The Templars, in their focus on internal security, failed to manage their external perception. They never cultivated a public relations strategy or sought to demystify themselves for the masses. They assumed their deeds would speak for themselves, but in the absence of their own voice, others were all too happy to do the speaking for them. The very code that protected them from external threats ultimately created the perfect conditions for the most dangerous threat of all, a narrative of heresy and conspiracy, meticulously crafted by a king who saw their silence not as devotion but as guilt. While their banking operations were revolutionary, the Templars understood that a financial empire built solely on moving money was inherently vulnerable. True, lasting power required generating wealth from the ground up. This realization led to their sixth pivotal decision, a comprehensive and shrewd diversification of their economy that transformed them from reliant charity cases into self-sustaining economic titans. They looked at the vast tracts of land donated to them by pious nobles, often marginal or underdeveloped plots, and saw not just spiritual offerings but untapped potential. They became some of the most innovative and ruthless agricultural entrepreneurs of the Middle Ages, applying military discipline to the business of farming. Across Europe, their commanderies were not just monasteries or barracks, they were bustling economic hubs humming with industry. In the fertile regions of France, they became masters of viniculture, cultivating vineyards that produced wines so sought after they were traded across the continent. In England, they capitalized on the booming wool trade, raising vast flocks of sheep on their lands and selling the high-quality wool to Flemish weavers at a premium. They didn't just stop at raw materials, recognizing the value in controlling the entire production chain. They built and operated their own watermills and windmills. A peasant farmer might grow the grain, but he would have to pay the Templars a portion of his harvest to use their mill to grind it into flour, a brilliant system that guaranteed them a cut of nearly every local transaction. This economic empire was managed with an efficiency that would be impressive even today. They practiced crop rotation to keep their fields fertile, imported new agricultural techniques from the East, and organized their vast estates into a network that could supply each other. A surplus of wine from Provence could be traded for wool from England, with all of it accounted for in meticulous ledgers kept by their brother scribes. They established and controlled local markets and fairs on their lands, collecting fees from every merchant and trader who set up a stall. This diversified portfolio made their income remarkably resilient. While a bad harvest or a shift in royal favor might impact one revenue stream, others would continue to flow. It provided a steady, predictable source of wealth that was entirely independent of the whims of donors. This financial independence was the bedrock of their power. It meant they could fund military campaigns, build castles, and pay their troops without having to constantly beg for alms or go into debt themselves. They became their own source of capital, and this economic freedom gave them a level of political autonomy that few other institutions could match. However, this spectacular success came with a devastating cost to their reputation. The image of the poor fellow soldiers of Christ, the humble knights who shared a single horse, began to fade, replaced by the reality of a powerful, land-rich corporation. The very sight of a Templar preceptory, often the most productive and technologically advanced estate in the region, with its efficient mills, lush vineyards, and bustling markets, started to chafe against their vows of poverty. To the local peasantry, they were not pious monks but demanding landlords and sharp businessmen. To the local nobility, they were aggressive competitors who used their tax-exempt status to undercut prices and dominate local economies. The whispers grew louder. Had the order lost its way? Were these warrior monks now more interested in profit margins than in saving souls? Their immense wealth, so carefully cultivated and managed, became their greatest public relations liability. It painted a colossal target on their backs, fueling the envy of kings and the suspicion of commoners alike. creating a narrative of corruption and greed that their enemies would later weaponize with deadly effect. This pragmatic approach to diplomacy in the Holy Land stands as one of the Templars' most complex and misunderstood decisions. While they were the most feared Christian warriors on the battlefield, they were also, paradoxically, among the most willing to negotiate with the enemy when it served a strategic purpose. The popular image of the Crusades is one of unrelenting holy war, a perpetual clash of civilizations with no room for nuance. But the reality on the ground for the Templars was far more complicated. They were not just crusaders, they were permanent residents of Outremer, tasked with governing territory, managing economies, and ensuring the safety of travelers and traders. To survive in this volatile landscape, rigid ideology often had to yield to practical necessity. This led them to a policy of realpolitik centuries before the term was coined, where a temporary truce with a Muslim emir could be more valuable than a Pyrrhic victory. Their dealings were not with a monolithic enemy, but with a diverse array of Muslim powers, each with their own ambitions and internal conflicts. The Templars became adept at playing these factions against one another. There are documented instances of them negotiating local truces with the formidable Saladin himself, not out of friendship, but to secure the safe passage of pilgrims or to secure the release of captured knights through prisoner exchanges. On occasion, they even engaged in cautious diplomacy with the infamous Order of Assassins, the Nizari Ismailis, who were a power unto themselves in the Syrian mountains. Both groups, despite their vastly different ideologies, shared a common interest in checking the power of more orthodox Sunni rulers. These were not alliances of faith, but marriages of convenience, cold calculations made to ensure survival in a deeply hostile environment. A Templar commander might share intelligence with an assassin envoy about the movements of a common foe like the Seljuk Turks, understanding that a weakened rival benefited them both. The benefits of this flexible approach were immense. Secured trade routes meant goods, information, and wealth could flow, which was the lifeblood of the Crusader states. Ransoming prisoners was not just an act of charity, it was a recovery of highly trained, expensively equipped military assets. Avoiding a costly and unnecessary battle preserved their limited manpower for fights they could actually win. This pragmatism demonstrated a level of strategic sophistication that often eluded newly arrived crusaders from Europe, who viewed any negotiation with the infidel as a betrayal of their sacred cause. The Templars, by contrast, were the seasoned professionals. They understood the rhythms of desert warfare, the importance of intelligence, and the fact that today's adversary could be tomorrow's necessary, if uneasy, partner in maintaining a fragile regional balance of power. However, this necessary pragmatism came with a severe political cost back in Europe. Whispers of their dealings inevitably filtered west, twisted and exaggerated by distance and prejudice. To a pious noble in France or a zealous cleric in Rome, the idea that the holy warriors of Christ were treating with the very infidels they were sworn to destroy was sacrilege. It didn't matter that the goal was to secure a road for pilgrims or save Christian lives. The act itself was seen as a contamination. Their enemies, particularly those jealous of their power and wealth, seized on these rumors. The accusations began to crystallize. If the Templars were so comfortable dealing with Muslims, perhaps they had been corrupted. Perhaps their secret rituals involved adopting Islamic practices. Their willingness to engage with the enemy, a key to their longevity in the East, became a primary weapon for those who sought to destroy them in the West, painting them not as savvy strategists, but as faithless traitors in league with the very forces they were meant to combat. Yet, even as the Templars navigated the complex political landscape of the Holy Land, a different kind of challenge was brewing back in Europe, one that threatened their very existence as an independent entity. The early 13th century was a time of mounting crisis for the Crusader states. Key strongholds had been lost, resources were stretched thin, and the Christian presence in the East seemed perpetually on the brink of collapse. In the face of this escalating emergency, Pope Innocent III, one of the most powerful and reform-minded popes of the Middle Ages, conceived of a radical solution. Looking at the two great military orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers, he saw not two pillars of strength, but a problematic duplication. Here were two massively wealthy, powerful organizations, each with their own networks, their own armies, and their own often competing agendas. From the papal perspective, this looked like immense inefficiency. Why maintain two separate command structures, two competing sets of castles, and two rival pools of resources when a single, unified order could wield all that power with focused, devastating efficiency? The proposal was put forward. The Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller would be merged into a single, new military order. This was not a casual suggestion. It was a serious papal initiative aimed at consolidating Christian strength for a final, decisive effort to secure the Holy Land. For many observers, it made perfect strategic sense. A united order would eliminate the petty squabbles and territorial jealousies that sometimes hampered the defense of the Crusader kingdoms. It would pool the vast financial resources of both groups, creating a war chest of unimaginable size. It would streamline command, ensuring that all military efforts were coordinated under a single Grand Master, answering directly to the Pope. On paper, it was the most logical move possible. The Templars, however, reacted with immediate and fierce opposition. To the outside world, their refusal might have looked like stubbornness or arrogance, but from their perspective, it was a fight for their soul. Their identity was not just a label, it was a deeply ingrained culture built over a century. They had their own rule, their own rituals, their own way of waging war and managing their affairs. To merge with the Hospitallers would mean dissolving everything that made them unique. The Hospitallers, though also warrior monks, had originated as caregivers for the sick and still maintained that charitable function as a core part of their identity. The Templars were, from their inception, pure soldiers. This was a fundamental philosophical divide that they were unwilling to bridge. They believed their specific, focused military ethos was their greatest strength, and diluting it with another mission would make them less effective, not more. Furthermore, they deeply distrusted the idea of handing control over their meticulously built infrastructure to a new, combined leadership. They had spent decades cultivating their banking network, constructing their castles, and training their knights to operate according to a specific doctrine. The thought of seeing those resources redirected or their commanderies handed over to a former rival was anathema. They had fought too hard for their autonomy, secured through papal bulls like Omni-Datum Optimum, to simply surrender it for the sake of theoretical efficiency. This was a calculated gamble. They were betting that their own independent strength was sufficient and that the Pope would not force the issue. In the short term, they won. The merger plan, faced with such staunch resistance, was eventually dropped. The Templars had preserved their sovereignty, but at a tremendous long-term cost. Their refusal entrenched a bitter rivalry with the Hospitallers that often manifested as a lack of cooperation on the battlefield. Instead of presenting a united front, the two orders sometimes seemed more focused on competing for glory, influence, and donations than on defeating their common enemy. This fragmentation of Christian military power created weaknesses that astute Muslim commanders like Saladin and later Baybars were all too willing to exploit. The Templars' fierce protection of their independence, a testament to their institutional pride, ultimately revealed a critical blind spot. an inability to see that sometimes survival requires subsuming individual glory for the sake of the greater good. While their castles secured the land, the Templars understood that the lifeblood of the Crusader states flowed across the sea. The vast, often treacherous Mediterranean was not a barrier but a highway, and controlling it was just as critical as holding any fortress. This led to their ambitious and costly pivot into maritime power, a decision that transformed them from a land-based military order into a formidable naval force. They embarked on building a dedicated fleet, a staggering undertaking that consumed vast resources. These were not simple transport vessels, they were specialized ships designed for multiple roles. Heavy-duty cargo ships, known as huissiers, were built to carry the massive war horses of the nightly charge, along with armor, weapons, and supplies. Faster galleys, powered by both oar and sail, served as escorts to protect these valuable convoys from the ever-present threat of Muslim pirates and rival fleets. This naval armada became the essential logistical spine connecting the Order's European heartland to its eastern frontier, ensuring a steady flow of reinforcements, pilgrims, and precious materials to sustain the fight. This mastery of the sea lanes unlocked new and incredibly lucrative revenue streams, further blurring the line between Holy Order and mercantile empire. With their own secure fleet, the Templars could now offer a premium service, guaranteed safe passage. They essentially established a protection racket on a grand scale, charging other merchant vessels hefty fees to join their escorted convoys. For a trader from Genoa or Venice, the choice was simple: risk a solo journey and likely lose everything to pirates, or pay the Templar toll and sleep soundly knowing their cargo and their life was under the protection of the most feared warriors on the water. This practice was so profitable it became a cornerstone of their naval economy. Furthermore, the line between defense and offense quickly blurred. Their war galleys, when not escorting convoys, often engaged in what can only be described as state-sanctioned piracy. They would actively hunt Muslim merchant ships, seizing their cargoes and selling them for profit, all under the convenient justification of harming the enemy's economy. A captured ship laden with spices, silk, or timber was a windfall that directly funded their operations, turning their naval operations into a self-financing enterprise of plunder and protection. Their strategic ports, particularly the great coastal fortress of Acre, evolved into bustling nerve centers of this maritime empire. Acre was more than a military base. It was a thriving economic hub where the Templars controlled the docks, warehouses, and customs houses. Here, the wealth of the East, spices, sugar, dyes, and luxury goods was unloaded and traded, with the Order taking a cut of every transaction. They established a similar powerful presence in Marseille, creating a seamless logistical chain across the entire Mediterranean. This control over key ports gave them immense influence over the entire regional economy, making them indispensable partners and feared competitors to the great Italian maritime republics. The Order was no longer just a customer of these merchant cities. It was a direct rival, using its unique combination of martial power and papal privilege to dominate trade. This expansion into naval power, however, came with significant and unforeseen consequences. The immense cost of building, maintaining, and crewing a fleet drained resources that could have been spent reinforcing armies or building more land-based fortifications. It stretched their already complex organization even thinner, demanding they develop entirely new expertise in shipbuilding, navigation, and naval combat. Most dangerously, it thrust them into direct economic competition with the very powers whose support they often relied upon. The merchant republics of Genoa and Venice had long considered the Mediterranean their exclusive domain. They watched with growing alarm and resentment as the Templars used their special status to muscle in on their trade routes, offering lower fees or using their military might to gain advantages. This created an undercurrent of diplomatic friction that would later prove costly. When the Templars eventually needed strong allies in Europe to counter the accusations of the French king, they found that many of the powerful commercial states they had competed with were less than eager to come to their defense. Their decision to rule the waves had granted them unparalleled strategic mobility and wealth, but it also isolated them from potential allies and committed them to a vast, expensive enterprise that would sink with the final loss of the Crusader coast. Amidst the clatter of swords and the solemnity of prayer, the Templars made a decision that would brand their image into history itself: the adoption of the stark, blood-red cross patè against the pure white of their mantle. This was far more than a uniform. It was a heraldic declaration of their entire reason for being. In the visual language of the Middle Ages, where symbols carried immense power, this emblem was a masterpiece of communication. The white background represented purity, a life cleansed of sin through their monastic vows. The red cross, a color vividly evoking the blood of Christ and the sacrifice of martyrdom, declared their readiness to die for their faith. It was a promise and a warning stitched onto every knight's shoulder. On the battlefield, this symbol served as a powerful psychological tool. In the chaos of a melee, the sight of that uniform red cross advancing in a disciplined charge was a beacon for allied forces and a thing of terror for their adversaries. It created an instant, unmistakable identity, transforming a collection of individual knights into a single, terrifying entity. For the brother wearing it, the cross was a constant, physical reminder of his sacred oath. It was a weight heavier than his chainmail, a visual pledge that every action, every swing of his sword, was in service to a higher purpose. This bolstered morale and fostered an unparalleled esprit de corps. They were not just fighting for a king or a patch of land, but under the direct banner of God. Beyond the dust of battle, the Red Cross functioned with the efficiency of a modern corporate logo. In the cathedrals and courts of Europe, it became an instantly recognizable brand of holy valor. A traveling Templar, his white mantle marked with that bold crimson cross, was a walking advertisement for the Order's mission. He attracted stares of awe and respect, inspiring young nobles to seek glory in his ranks and prompting pious lords to open their coffers in support. The symbol served as a universal guarantee of trust and authority. A document sealed with the Templar cross was as good as gold, and a knight bearing it could command respect from Paris to Jerusalem. It elegantly packaged their complex dual identity into a single, potent image that resonated across cultures and social classes. Yet, the very potency of this symbol made it a double-edged sword. As the Order's power and wealth grew, the perception of the Red Cross began to subtly shift in the minds of their enemies. What was once a mark of pious sacrifice started to be viewed by some as a symbol of arrogance, a declaration that the Templars believed themselves to be above the laws of men and nations. Their accusers, particularly in the final days of the Order, would weaponize this iconic imagery. They twisted its meaning, alleging that the cross wasn't a veneration of Christ's sacrifice but a secret mockery of it, a symbol of a hidden, heretical creed. The very thing that had unified them and made them legendary was perverted into the primary evidence of their corruption, proving that in the court of public opinion, even the most sacred of symbols can be ruthlessly turned against their creators. This single-minded focus on the Holy Land became the very soul of the Templar mission, a strategic anchor that defined their every move for nearly 2 centuries. While their European commanderies generated immense wealth and served as vital recruiting centers, the leadership in Jerusalem viewed them through a single lens. How could these distant assets best serve the war effort in the East? The finest knights, the most advanced armor, the bulk of their liquid capital, all were funneled relentlessly toward the defense of the Crusader kingdoms. A preceptor in England or Provence might manage vast agricultural estates and bustling banks, but his primary duty was to extract resources and ship them to the front lines. This created a constant, one-way flow of manpower and treasure from west to east, leaving their European operations often under-garrisoned and managed by lower-ranking brothers or hired secular administrators. For a time, this immense sacrifice paid dividends in prestige. They were celebrated across Christendom as the unflinching shield of Jerusalem, the last line of defense whose commitment never wavered. This reputation as the most dedicated defenders of the faith brought them unparalleled donations and recruits, fueling a virtuous cycle that strengthened their ability to hold the line. However, this grand strategy created a dangerous vulnerability that festered out of sight, back in the heart of Europe. While the Templars' gaze was fixed on the deserts of Outremer, the political landscape at home was shifting dramatically. Powerful monarchs like Philip IV of France and Edward I of England were actively consolidating their power, centralizing authority, and brooking no rivals within their borders. They looked upon the Templar network within their kingdoms with growing unease. These were not just monasteries, they were fortified compounds exempt from local taxes and laws, staffed by armed men who answered to a foreign master in the east. The Order's European holdings, essential for funding the war, increasingly appeared to these kings as a state within a state, a deeply alien entity whose ultimate loyalty lay elsewhere. The Templars, confident in their papal protections and consumed by the existential struggle in the Holy Land, largely failed to nurture the crucial political relationships that could have protected these assets. They operated with an air of detached privilege, assuming their sacred mission would insulate them from earthly politics. They didn't see the storm clouds gathering over Paris and London because they were too focused on the war in Acre and Jerusalem. The catastrophic fall of Jerusalem to Saladin in 1187 was a spiritual and strategic earthquake for the entire crusading movement, but for the Templars, it was a body blow to their core identity. They fought with legendary ferocity at the Battle of Hattin and in the defense of the city itself, but their defeat was total. The loss of their namesake, the very Temple Mount that housed their headquarters, was an incalculable humiliation. Though they shifted their base to the coastal city of Acre and continued the fight for another century, something fundamental had been broken. The dream of a secure Christian kingdom of Jerusalem was revealed to be a fragile illusion. The final, crushing blow came with the fall of Acre in 1291. After a brutal siege, the last major Crusader stronghold was overrun by the Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil. The Templars, true to form, were the last to leave, forming the desperate rearguard as the city fell around them. Their Grand Master, Guillaume de Beaujeu, died fighting in the streets. With Acre's fall, the Templars were not just defeated, they were rendered obsolete. Their entire reason for existence, the protection and defense of the Holy Land, vanished in the smoke of the burning city. Suddenly, the massive infrastructure they had built across Europe looked less like a support system for a holy war and more like a suspiciously well-funded anomaly. Kings who had once tolerated their special status now saw a powerful, wealthy, and heavily armed international organization with no clear purpose. The constant flow of resources to the east had stopped, but the Templar wealth remained, now just sitting within their borders. The question began to be asked in royal courts: what exactly are the Templars for now? The very dedication that had once earned them admiration now made them seem like a redundant and expensive relic. Their European commanderies, once the engine of a glorious crusade, were now just unaccountable fortresses full of money. This left them politically exposed and perilously vulnerable. Without a war to fight in the East, their immense power and privileges appeared not as necessary tools for a sacred mission, but as arrogant anachronisms in a new age of rising nation-states. Their greatest strength, their unwavering focus, had become their most fatal strategic liability, leaving them isolated and defenseless against the greed and ambition of a king who no longer saw any use for them. And so, with their identity forged and their privileges secured, the Templars needed a home, a physical and spiritual anchor for their burgeoning empire. They found it not in a newly built fortress, but atop one of the most contested, spiritually charged pieces of real estate on earth, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. This was not a random choice of barracks. It was a decision dripping with symbolic intent and strategic genius. By establishing their headquarters on the vast platform believed by Christians and Jews to be the site of Solomon's Temple, and by Muslims as the noble sanctuary housing the dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, they were planting their flag at the very epicenter of the medieval world's spiritual imagination. They took the name Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, but their residence in the royal quarters adjacent to Al-Aqsa Mosque, which the Crusaders had reconsecrated as a palace, instantly granted them an aura of ancient, kingly authority. They weren't just new knights, they were the heirs to a sacred legacy, the guardians of a holy of holies. Strategically, the location was unbeatable. The Temple Mount was a natural citadel, a raised, fortified compound dominating the skyline of Jerusalem. It offered commanding views of the city and the surrounding approaches, making it the perfect nerve center for their operations. From this elevated stronghold, they could control access to the city's heart and project their power throughout the region. But the Templars saw more than just tactical advantages in the ancient stones beneath their feet. They began extensive excavations and renovations within the vast substructures of the mount, a labyrinth of vaults, tunnels, and chambers known as Solomon's Stables. While their initial purpose was likely practical, creating storage spaces, barracks, and stables for their growing contingent, their activities in the hidden depths of such a mythic site were a recipe for legend. Whispers began almost immediately. What were these secretive knights truly doing down there in the dark? The most popular and enduring theory was that they had unearthed something of immense spiritual and material value. Perhaps it was the lost treasures of Solomon's Temple, said to include the Ark of the Covenant or the legendary Holy Grail itself. Maybe it was ancient manuscripts containing lost knowledge. There is no credible historical evidence they found anything of the sort, but the mere possibility, combined with their sudden and explosive rise to wealth and power, was enough to fuel 1,000 stories. This aura of discovered secrets became a core part of the Templar mystique, enhancing their reputation as not just holy warriors, but as guardians of profound and hidden truths. This powerful symbolism, however, came with a terrifying downside. By choosing to center their entire operation on one of Islam's third holiest sites, the Templars made themselves the primary target for every Muslim commander intent on reclaiming Jerusalem for Islam. They weren't just another Christian garrison, they were an occupying force defiling a sacred Muslim space with their presence. Their headquarters was the ultimate prize, a symbol that would galvanize their enemies and ensure they would always be in the crosshairs of the most determined opposition. Furthermore, back in Europe, their intimate association with the Temple Mount's deep and complex history began to attract a different kind of dangerous speculation. As their reputation for secrecy grew, critics and enemies started to weave a darker narrative. They speculated that the knights hadn't just found gold or relics under the Temple Mount. they had discovered heretical knowledge or been corrupted by something ancient and occult. Their initiation rituals, conducted away from prying eyes, were rumored to involve practices learned from esoteric texts found in their excavations. The site's connection to the Jewish temple, a faith often misunderstood and mistrusted in medieval Europe, added another layer of suspicion for those looking for evidence of deviation from Christian orthodoxy. In the end, the very ground that gave them their name and their sacred purpose also provided the raw material for the accusations of heresy and occultism that would eventually be used to destroy them. Their home was their greatest strength and their most profound vulnerability. This unparalleled freedom of movement granted by the Pope himself effectively transformed every traveling Templar into a diplomat and every preceptory into an embassy. A knight riding from London to Rome, or a sergeant sailing from Marseille to Cyprus, carried with him an invisible shield. He could pass through the war-torn fields of France during the 100 Years' War, cross the tense borders between rival Italian city-states, or navigate the complex political landscape of the Iberian Peninsula, all with a profound sense of security. Local sheriffs, border guards, and even rival knights knew that to detain or search a brother of the temple was to risk the wrath of the Holy See. This wasn't just a convenience, it was the absolute bedrock of their entire international operation. Their revolutionary banking system, which allowed a pilgrim to deposit funds in Paris and withdraw them in Jerusalem, relied entirely on the guaranteed safe passage of their officials and the sanctity of their correspondence. A letter of credit was just a piece of parchment unless the man carrying it could deliver it without being robbed, and the network of commanderies that honored it could operate without fear of having their assets seized by a greedy local lord. This immunity made them the perfect intermediaries in the treacherous world of medieval power politics. Kings who were openly at war might still need to communicate, to negotiate truces, arrange prisoner exchanges, or discuss mutual threats. Sending a diplomat from your own court was risky. They could be captured and used as a bargaining chip, but a Templar, he was a neutral party, a trusted third face whose primary allegiance was to God and the Pope, not to any earthly crown. Philip IV of France and Edward I of England, despite their frequent conflicts, could both trust a Templar envoy to carry a message with discretion and deliver it faithfully. This role granted the order a bird's-eye view of European geopolitics that was utterly unique. Their officials weren't just messengers, they were intelligence gatherers par excellence. A Templar commander in Scotland would hear of English military preparations. A treasurer in Naples would learn of papal financial needs. This information flowed back to the order's leadership, giving them an almost prescient understanding of international events, which they could use to protect their assets, advise their allies, and position themselves advantageously. They became the medieval equivalent of a global intelligence agency, their knowledge itself a form of immense soft power. However, this privileged existence inevitably bred deep-seated resentment and fear among the very monarchs who utilized their services. To a king trying to consolidate his power and assert control over every inch of his domain, the sight of these white-mantled knights moving through his lands with impunity was a constant irritation. They were a living, breathing reminder that his authority was not absolute. They answered to a higher foreign power. They could transport chests of gold across his borders without paying a single coin in tolls or taxes. They could withhold financial information about his own accounts from his own officials. This created a pervasive and dangerous perception that the Templars were a state within a state, an alien entity that operated by its own rules on soil that was supposed to be sovereign. This resentment festered for decades, a slow-burning fuse waiting for a spark. That spark would eventually come from a king, Philip IV of France, who was deeply in debt to the order and utterly determined to be the master of all within his kingdom. He looked upon the Templars' diplomatic immunity not as a sacred privilege, but as an arrogant challenge to his royal authority, a challenge he was all too willing to meet with force, proving that the very protections that made the order so effective also made it a tantalizing target for any ruler seeking to demonstrate that his word was the ultimate law. While their financial and diplomatic prowess secured their influence, the Templars understood that ultimate power in the medieval world was still projected through stone and steel. They recognized that winning a war often meant not outfighting your enemy in the open field, but outthinking them at the gates of their strongest fortresses. This led to their 14th pivotal decision, to become masters of the siege, investing a colossal portion of their wealth and intellect into developing the most advanced military engineering corps of their age. They weren't just training knights to swing swords, they were recruiting and training a specialized class of military engineers, sappers, and architects, turning the art of siege warfare into a precise science. Their expertise covered the entire spectrum of medieval combat engineering, from the terrifying offensive power of massive counterweight trebuchets to the delicate, deadly work of tunneling under castle walls to collapse them from within. The trebuchet, the grand artillery of its day, was a weapon the Templars perfected. These were not simple catapults, they were complex machines of terror and precision, capable of hurling massive stone projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds over hundreds of yards. Templar engineers could calculate trajectories to pound a specific section of a wall repeatedly, creating a breach for their assault troops, or they could lob diseased animal carcasses and rotting refuse over the walls to spread sickness and despair among the defenders. But their mastery extended far beyond these iconic machines. They became experts in the dark, claustrophobic art of mining. Teams of Templar sappers, often working in shifts day and night, would dig tunnels beneath an enemy fortress, shoring up the passageways with wooden beams as they went. Once directly under the foundation, they would hollow out a chamber, pack it with flammable brushwood and animal fat, and then set it ablaze. As the supporting beams burned away, the tunnel, and hopefully the section of wall above it, would collapse in a cloud of dust and rubble, creating a sudden and devastating entry point. This engineering prowess was equally critical on defense. The Templars didn't just build castles, they designed them. Their masterpiece, Chateau Pèlerin or Pilgrim's Castle, stands as a testament to their architectural genius. Built on a peninsula with the sea on three sides, its designers created a layered defense that was decades ahead of its time. It featured concentric walls, meaning an attacker who breached the outer wall would find themselves trapped in a killing zone, exposed to fire from the even higher inner walls. Its seaward side included a protected harbor, allowing it to be resupplied and reinforced by ship even during a siege. The castle had its own freshwater springs, making it impossible to starve out, and its massive, sloping glacis walls were designed to deflect the impact of siege engine projectiles and make scaling ladders useless. It was so formidable that it was never taken by force, only abandoned after the fall of Acre. This technical dominance provided a monumental advantage. The mere presence of the Templar siege train outside a city's walls could be enough to force a surrender, saving countless lives on both sides. Their ability to quickly reduce enemy strongholds accelerated campaigns and secured vital territories. In defense, their engineered castles multiplied the effectiveness of their garrisons, allowing a few hundred men to hold out against armies thousands strong. This reputation for invincibility, both in attack and defense, became a key part of their psychological warfare, making adversaries think twice before engaging them. However, this reliance on technological superiority came with significant strategic trade-offs. Maintaining this expertise was incredibly expensive. The construction and transport of massive siege engines required vast amounts of specialized timber, rope, and metal, not to mention the skilled craftsmen to build and operate them. This created a dependency on a small, irreplaceable core of experts. If a team of veteran sappers was lost in a tunnel collapse or a cotter of master engineers was killed in an ambush, that knowledge could not be easily replaced. Most critically, their focus on perfecting these established techniques of siege and fortification may have made them slow to recognize and adapt to evolving battlefield tactics. As their Mamluk enemies began to master more mobile forms of warfare, using horse archers to harry and outmaneuver rather than engage in set-piece sieges, the Templars' immense investment in static defense and heavy siege technology began to look increasingly like a magnificent, but ultimately inflexible, relic of a past age of warfare. This strategic commitment to neutrality was a calculated gamble born from their unique international position. With commanderies, banks, and estates scattered across every kingdom from England to Cyprus, the Templars had a vested interest in stability. Taking sides in a war between, say, the Plantagenet kings of England and the Capetian kings of France would have been commercial and operational suicide. If they had thrown their military support behind the English crown, their vast properties in France would have been immediately confiscated by the French king. Conversely, aligning with France would have jeopardized their immensely profitable banking operations with the English monarchy. Their policy of declared neutrality was therefore less a moral stance and more a ruthless business decision, essential for preserving their sprawling financial empire. It allowed their officials to continue moving freely across war-torn borders, managing estates, collecting debts, and transporting treasure, all while the feudal armies of their patrons clashed around them. They became the ultimate neutrals, the Switzerland of the medieval world, and this unique status allowed their economic machine to hum along uninterrupted by the petty squabbles of kings. However, this carefully maintained impartiality came with a severe and often hidden cost to their reputation. In the highly charged, honor-bound culture of medieval aristocracy, loyalty was the ultimate currency. Kings and nobles who donated land and wealth to the order did so with an unspoken expectation of fealty. When war broke out, these patrons looked to their beneficiaries for support, not just financial but martial. The sight of Templar preceptories operating peacefully within their borders, refusing to contribute knights or funds to the war effort, was seen as a profound betrayal. To a king marshalling his forces for an existential conflict, the Templars' neutrality looked less like shrewd business and more like cowardice, greed, or outright treachery. Whispers began to circulate that the order had grown too powerful and too arrogant, that they served only themselves and their own wealth, having forgotten their sacred duty to defend Christendom. This perception of selfishness festered over decades, eroding the deep well of goodwill they had accumulated during their early years in the Holy Land. They were seen as profiteers, growing rich off the conflicts of others while offering nothing in return. This erosion of trust culminated in a fatal vulnerability when they faced their greatest crisis. When King Philip IV of France decided to destroy the order in 1307, he did so with stunning ease, in part because the Templars had no powerful, committed allies willing to stand up for them. Their policy of neutrality had left them politically isolated. Why should the King of England or the Holy Roman Emperor risk a diplomatic incident with France to defend an organization that had never unequivocally supported them? The Templars had no feudal army of their own in Europe, and they had not cultivated the kind of deep, reciprocal alliances that could have provided a counterweight to Philip's aggression. They had placed all their faith in their papal protections and their financial leverage, believing these abstract shields were stronger than the concrete support of earthly allies. Their calculated neutrality, which had served them so well in preserving their wealth during times of peace, proved to be a brittle defense against the focused, malicious ambition of a single determined king. They had mastered the art of navigating between powers, but in the end, they discovered that standing in the middle of the road leaves one exposed to being struck by traffic from both directions. In a world where loyalty was often for sale to the highest bidder, the Templars made a conscious and costly choice to prioritize quality over quantity. Their gates were not open to all who sought glory or a full belly. They were guarded by one of the most rigorous and exclusive recruitment systems of the medieval era. To even be considered, a candidate had to meet a stringent set of criteria that would filter out all but the most committed and capable. First and foremost, he had to be of legitimate noble birth, a requirement that ensured he was already trained from childhood in the arts of war, horsemanship, and command. He had to be free of any debts or legal entanglements, ensuring he entered the order with a clean slate, owing his allegiance to no one outside the brotherhood. He could not be married or betrothed, and he had to swear solemn, lifelong vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, formally severing all ties to his former life and family. This was not a casual application process. Prospective members underwent a lengthy period of observation and interrogation. Senior knights would investigate his background, his reputation, and his motivations. They needed to be certain he was not a spy sent by a rival power or a greedy opportunist hoping to get his hands on the Order's legendary wealth. The final step was a stark warning delivered during the initiation ceremony itself. The candidate was reminded in graphic detail of the harshness of the life he was choosing. The brutal discipline, the constant danger, the likelihood of a painful death in a distant land, and the absolute requirement to surrender his own will to the commands of his superiors. Only those who persisted, fully aware of the sacrifices demanded, were welcomed into the fold. This meticulous vetting created a brotherhood of unmatched cohesion and reliability. A Templar knight was not a mercenary. He was a true believer, a disciplined instrument of the Order's will. On the battlefield, this meant he could be relied upon to hold the line against impossible odds or to execute a complex tactical withdrawal without it disintegrating into a panicked rout. Their unity was their strength, a single-minded force that made them the most formidable professional soldiers of their age. Yet, this elite status came with a severe and ultimately crippling strategic drawback. By restricting their recruitment pool almost exclusively to the nobility, the Templars placed a hard cap on their potential numbers. The class of trained knights was never large to begin with, and the Order had to compete with other military orders, royal armies, and the simple fact that many nobles preferred to stay on their comfortable European estates. After a catastrophic defeat like the Battle of Hattin in 1187, where hundreds of Templar knights were slaughtered or captured, replacing those losses was a painfully slow and difficult process. They couldn't simply conscript peasants or offer a signing bonus to eager commoners. They had to find, vet, and train new members from a very small and exclusive segment of society. This problem was compounded by their own high standards of discipline. The life was so austere and dangerous that it naturally deterred all but the most fervently committed. While this ensured quality, it did nothing for quantity. As the 13th century wore on and the military situation in the Holy Land grew increasingly desperate, this inability to rapidly regenerate their fighting force became a critical weakness. They were facing the Mamluks of Egypt, a slave soldier dynasty that could draw on vast populations for recruitment and train new soldiers in a highly effective system. The Templars, by contrast, were trying to refill a cracked glass with an eyedropper. Each night lost was a significant blow, a highly specialized asset that could not be easily replaced. Their preceptories in Europe, for all their wealth, were often staffed by aging brothers and sergeants, not the fresh young knights needed for the front lines. The very exclusivity that had forged their legendary prowess now left them a brittle force, magnificent but fragile, unable to withstand the relentless, grinding warfare that would eventually consume their world. They had built an army of superlative quality, but in the end they simply ran out of superlative men. This incredible accumulation of wealth presented the Templars with a monumental choice: what to do with it all. Unlike kings who would squander fortunes on lavish courts, grand palaces, or personal luxuries, the Order made a deliberate and disciplined decision to hoard their capital. Their fiscal policy was one of extreme conservatism, a reflection of their monastic vows of poverty on an institutional scale. The rivers of gold flowing into their treasury from banking fees, estate profits, and donations were not spent on finery. They were dammed up, creating a vast and legendary reservoir of liquid wealth. This was a calculated strategy of power through solvency. By maintaining this enormous war chest, they ensured they were always the creditor, never the debtor. They could fund a military campaign for years without needing to ask anyone for money. They could loan a king the equivalent of a nation's entire annual revenue, knowing that this financial leverage translated directly into political influence. Their ability to act immediately and decisively, bankrolled by their own immense savings, made them an indispensable force in the constant financial emergencies of medieval statecraft. However, this very strategy of accumulation, so logical from a banker's perspective, created a dangerous and ultimately fatal perception among the very rulers they served. While the Templars lived austere personal lives, their institution was sitting on a mountain of gold that became the stuff of legend and envy. They built formidable treasuries like the famous vault at the Paris Temple, which was considered the most secure bank in Europe, but they did not engage in the kind of high-profile philanthropy that might have softened their image. They didn't endow great public hospitals or cathedrals on the scale of their wealth, as some monastic orders did. To the outside world, particularly to the nobility and commoners struggling with taxes and famine, this began to look less like prudent management and more like pure, un-Christian greed. The original image of the poor fellow soldiers of Christ seemed like a cruel joke. Whispers grew that they had lost their way, that their vow of poverty had been twisted into a corporate obsession with wealth for its own sake. They were seen as aloof, secretive, and miserly, a remote financial power that profited from the wars and pilgrimages of others without sharing the burden in a visibly charitable way. This simmering resentment found its most dangerous expression in the person of King Philip IV of France. Philip was a monarch in dire financial straits, having exhausted his treasury through a costly war with England and rampant inflation. He was deeply, personally in debt to the Templars, a humiliating position for a king who believed in his own absolute power. He looked upon the Order's wealth not with gratitude for their financial services, but with a covetous and paranoid rage. To him, the Templars were not holy warriors but arrogant bankers, a state within his state that had the gall to be wealthier than the crown itself. Their hoarded riches represented a solution to all his financial problems, a tantalizing prize just waiting to be seized. Their fiscal conservatism, which had been the bedrock of their power and independence, was now the very reason a king would decide they were too dangerous to be allowed to exist. The treasure they had so carefully guarded and grown over 2 centuries did not protect them. It painted the largest possible target on their backs, proving that in the eyes of a desperate and avaricious ruler, the greatest sin was not heresy, but having deep pockets and refusing to empty them into his own. Yet for all their engineering genius and financial acumen, the Templars' most catastrophic failure was not in their planning or their piety, but in their inability to evolve on the battlefield itself. The very military doctrine that had forged their legend, the unstoppable charge of heavily armored knights, slowly hardened into a dangerous dogma, a relic of a bygone era of warfare. While their Mamluk adversaries were perfecting a new form of mobile, combined arms combat, the Templars remained wedded to the tactics of the past, a miscalculation that would prove fatal in the sun-scorched fields of the Holy Land. The core of their identity was the knightly charge, a terrifying spectacle of thundering hooves and leveled lances meant to shatter enemy lines in a single, decisive moment. This tactic had worked brilliantly against disorganized bands or feudal levies, but it was woefully inadequate against the highly disciplined and agile armies fielded by commanders like Baybars and Qutuz. The Mamluks, elite slave soldiers of Turkic origin, were masters of the feigned retreat, a tactic designed to exploit the Templars' greatest weakness, their relentless aggression. They would harass the Crusader lines with clouds of horse archers, unleashing volleys of arrows from a distance, then appear to break and flee in disorder. For a Templar commander, this was the signal to launch the glorious charge, to ride down the fleeing enemy and claim victory. But it was a trap. The Mamluks were not routing, they were drawing the heavy cavalry into a killing zone. As the Templars plunged forward, their formations would inevitably stretch and break, their horses exhausted from the weight of their armor and the heat of the pursuit. Once the knights were isolated and winded, the Mamluk light cavalry would wheel around and attack from all sides, while fresh reserves of heavy cavalry moved in for the kill. The Templars, trained to fight as a cohesive hammer blow, were suddenly surrounded, outmaneuvered, and cut down piecemeal. Their greatest strength had been systematically turned against them. This tragic pattern played out with devastating consequences at battles like La Fourbe in 1244 and Ain Jalut in 1260. At La Fourbe, a combined Crusader army, including a significant Templar contingent, was utterly annihilated by a Mamluk force using precisely these tactics. The Crusaders charged into what they believed was a disorganized enemy, only to be enveloped and destroyed. The loss of life was staggering, decimating the military strength of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, from which it never truly recovered. Ain Jalut, though a Mamluk victory over the Mongols, further demonstrated their tactical superiority and marked the rise of a power that would soon turn its full attention to eradicating the Crusader presence for good. The Templars, watching from their mighty castles, seemed unable or unwilling to learn the lesson. They continued to believe that sheer courage and the weight of a well-executed charge would eventually prevail, a faith that was becoming increasingly disconnected from the grim realities of the battlefield. Their over-reliance on static fortifications, while initially a masterstroke, compounded this tactical inertia. Pouring immense resources into their castles had created a defensive mindset, tying down their best troops in garrison duty and fostering a belief that safety lay behind high walls. This made them even more hesitant to risk their limited field armies in open combat unless the conditions seemed perfect, creating a cycle of caution and then, when they did finally engage, reckless overcommitment. They failed to invest in developing their own significant forces of light cavalry or horse archers to counter the Mamluk threat, perhaps viewing such troops as less honorable or beneath their knightly status. This institutional conservatism, this clinging to what had worked in the 11th century, left them strategically paralyzed in the 13th. They were like a master fencer who suddenly finds himself in a gunfight, still relying on parries and thrusts against an opponent who refuses to fight at close quarters. The world of warfare had moved on, and the once innovative Templars were left behind, their legendary military prowess fading into obsolescence just as they needed it most. And so, with their military relevance fading and their purpose questioned after the fall of Acre, the Knights Templar made their most catastrophic miscalculation. They failed to recognize that the greatest threat to their existence no longer came from Muslim armies in the east, but from a ruthless and calculating king in the very heart of Christendom. Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair for his handsome features that masked a cold and avaricious heart, was a new breed of monarch. He was a centralizer, a man obsessed with consolidating absolute power within the borders of France and brooking no rival institutions. He looked upon the Templars not as holy warriors, but as an affront to his sovereignty, a wealthy, independent, and armed state operating within his kingdom, answering to no one but a distant pope. The order, however, steeped in a century of privilege and papal favor, viewed this rising royal ambition with a dangerous sense of complacency. They were the bankers to kings, the financiers of popes. They had the full weight of church authority behind them, enshrined in documents like Omni-Datum Optimum. What could one king, even the King of France, truly do to them? This fatal arrogance blinded them to the shifting tectonic plates of European politics, where the power of nation-states was beginning to eclipse the universal authority of the Church. The warning signs were there for any who cared to see them. Philip was a man drowning in debt, much of it owed directly to the Templars who managed the French royal treasury. His costly wars with England and Flanders had emptied his coffers, and his disastrous decision to debase the coinage had sparked inflation and civil unrest. The Templars' immense liquid wealth, sitting tantalizingly within his reach in the Paris Temple, represented a solution to all his financial problems. Furthermore, Philip had already demonstrated his willingness to attack powerful institutions. He had engineered a brutal campaign to defame and destroy Pope Boniface VIII, a pontiff who had dared to challenge his royal authority, ultimately leading to the Pope's death after a violent arrest. He had then turned his ire on the Lombard bankers, expelling them from France and seizing their assets. The Templars, watching this unfold, should have seen a clear pattern emerging. Philip the Fair would use any means necessary, no matter how underhanded or brutal, to crush any entity that stood between him and absolute control. Yet the Order's leadership, perhaps insulated by their own wealth and privilege, dismissed these actions as problems for others. They believed their sacred mission and their financial indispensability would protect them where others had fallen. This profound misjudgment led to a tragic failure in diplomacy and defense. Instead of actively building a coalition of allies among other European monarchs or within the College of Cardinals, the Templars retreated behind their walls, relying on the increasingly fragile shield of papal protection. They made no concerted effort to publicly defend their reputation against the whispers of corruption and heresy that Philip's agents were already seeding throughout France. They did not mobilize their network to prepare for a potential legal or military assault. Their preceptories in France remained administrative and financial centers, not fortified strongholds ready for a siege. They were preparing for a world that no longer existed, a world where their ancient privileges would be respected, while Philip was meticulously planning for a new world order where the king's law was the only law. The hammer blow fell with chilling precision on Friday, October the 13th, 1307. Under the seal of absolute secrecy, Philip had issued orders to his bailiffs and knights across the entire kingdom. In a perfectly coordinated dawn raid, royal officials simultaneously stormed Templar properties from Normandy to Provence. The brothers were caught completely by surprise, arrested en masse as they slept or prayed, offered no chance to resist. The charges read out to them were as sensational as they were outlandish: denial of Christ, spitting on the cross, worshipping a mysterious idol called Baphomet, engaging in homosexual practices, and financial corruption. These accusations were a masterstroke of propaganda, designed to shock the conscience of Europe and provide a pious justification for what was, in reality, a massive seizure of assets. The Templars' confidence in their historic protections had been their undoing. They had underestimated the sheer audacity of a king who was willing to defy the church, fabricate evidence, and violate every notion of feudal law to achieve his goals. In a single morning, the most powerful military order in Christendom was brought to its knees, not by a foreign army, but by the calculated greed of a single man they had foolishly believed they controlled. As the net of accusations tightened around them, a climate of panic and desperation began to seep into the Templar commanderies across France. Faced with the terrifying reality of King Philip's coordinated arrests and the grotesque charges of heresy, some within the order made a fateful and ultimately self-destructive choice. Believing that their only hope lay in protecting the innermost workings of their brotherhood from profane eyes, they allegedly took torches and furnaces to their own archives. Priceless troves of internal documents detailed financial ledgers, minutes of chapter meetings, letters between preceptories, and manuals outlining their rituals were consigned to the flames in a desperate attempt to safeguard their secrets. This was not an act of sanctioned policy from the Grand Master, but rather a panicked, decentralized response from local commanders who believed they were acting in the Order's best interest, erasing anything that could be twisted by their enemies or used to unravel their entire organization. This act of self-censorship, born from a very real and justified fear, proved to be a catastrophic tactical error with devastating consequences for their legal defense. When the Templars were dragged before papal and royal inquisitors, they were confronted with a web of fabricated claims about their initiation ceremonies and financial practices. Their defense was reduced to simple denial, a chorus of "we did not do this" shouted into a void. They had, in their panic, destroyed the very evidence that could have provided a mundane and exonerating context for their customs. Had they preserved their financial records, they could have demonstrated the legitimate sources of their wealth, dispelling myths of demonic pacts or hidden treasure. Had they kept their ritual texts, they could have shown that their ceremonies, while perhaps unusual or intensely private, were not heretical but were instead focused on obedience, humility, and preparing for a holy death. Instead, they presented the prosecutors with a blank slate, an information vacuum that their enemies were all too happy to fill with the most salacious and damning fiction. The absence of their own records didn't just weaken their case, it actively empowered their accusers and ignited the imagination of the entire continent. In the place of facts, a sprawling ecosystem of rumor and legend rushed in. The fact that they had burned documents was itself taken as proof of guilt. Why destroy something if you have nothing to hide? This single act did more to cement their reputation as a shadowy, conspiratorial cult than any of Philip IV's pronouncements ever could. The mysterious Baphomet idol they were accused of worshipping transformed from a likely mistranslation or fabrication into a central pillar of the mythos, because there was no internal Templar text available to definitively say it was nonsense. Their destroyed archives became, in the public mind, a lost library of occult knowledge, convincing many that the Templars really were guardians of earth-shattering secrets too dangerous to see the light of day. This decision fundamentally altered the course of their history, transforming their story from one of historical fact into one of enduring mystery. By choosing the fire, they unintentionally granted their enemies a permanent victory in the court of public opinion, a victory that has lasted for centuries. The lack of a clear, written record from the order itself has forever left a door open for speculation, allowing every generation to project its own fantasies and fears onto the white mantle and red cross. The very act intended to protect their honor ultimately ensured that their true legacy would be forever obscured by smoke, and that the whispered accusations of a greedy king would echo far louder than any truth the ashes might have contained. The final, crushing blow to the Knights Templar came not from a battlefield defeat, but from a document issued by the very authority that had once been their greatest protector. In 1312, after years of brutal torture, coerced confessions, and a sham trial orchestrated by King Philip IV, Pope Clement V issued the papal bull known as Vox in Excelsis, a voice from on high. Its message was simple and absolute. The order of the Knights Templar was hereby suppressed, not found guilty, not condemned, but officially dissolved. This was a carefully worded legal maneuver, allowing the Pope to appease the French king and remove a problematic institution without formally declaring it heretical. For the thousands of Templars still languishing in dungeons or scattered across Europe, this was the end of their world. They were now men without a country, soldiers without an army, and monks without an order. Their reason for being had been erased with a stroke of a pen. Faced with this ultimate extinction, the Templar Brotherhood made a collective decision that has baffled and divided historians for centuries. Rather than organizing a coordinated, violent resistance, the vast majority of them laid down their arms and accepted their fate with a quiet, almost bewildering passivity. This was not a sudden collapse of courage. These were men who had faced down Mamluk armies and held the line at the gates of Acre. Their surrender was a complex calculation, born of shattered morale and a profound crisis of faith. For years, they had been subjected to relentless propaganda painting them as devil worshippers and perverts. Their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, had initially confessed under torture, a devastating blow to the morale of every brother who looked to him for unwavering strength. The Church, their spiritual mother for nearly 2 centuries, had now turned its back on them. Many simply could not comprehend whom they were supposed to fight. To take up arms against the King of France was treason. To fight the Pope was heresy. They were trapped in a nightmare with no enemy they could honorably draw their sword against. Their hope, a fragile and ultimately naive one, was that compliance would lead to mercy. They believed that by surrendering peacefully, they would be allowed to be absorbed into other monastic orders like the Hospitallers, carrying on their lives in prayer, or granted permission to live out their days in quiet retirement on a pension. They trusted in the systems of justice and mercy that were supposed to govern Christendom. This hope was a testament to how deeply their institutional identity had been broken. The warrior monks who had once defied kings and sultans were now pleading for a peaceful end, hoping the very institution that had betrayed them would offer a dignified exit. This widespread acquiescence allowed for the swift and total dismantling of the Templar legacy. Their vast estates were transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, their rivals, though a significant portion of the movable wealth undoubtedly found its way into the coffers of King Philip and other European monarchs. Their archives were seized or destroyed, their rituals forbidden, their name officially scrubbed from the rolls of Christendom. Without a fight to capture the public's imagination, without a last stand to be remembered in song and story, their demonization was complete. The narrative crafted by their accusers became the accepted history, largely unchallenged because the Templars themselves had vanished into silence. There were, of course, flickers of defiance that highlight what might have been. In Portugal, where the king had always valued the Templars and distrusted Philip's motives, The order was not suppressed but cleverly reinvented. King Diniz refused to persecute the brothers and instead established a new organization called the Order of Christ, into which the Portuguese Templars were seamlessly transferred. They kept their properties, their structure, and their expertise, simply operating under a new name. This Portuguese branch would go on to play a crucial role in the Age of Discovery, its cross even adorning the sails of Prince Henry the Navigator's ships. Similarly, in parts of Germany and Scotland, stories persist of Templars melting into local noble families or merging with other knightly guilds, their knowledge and traditions surviving in a fragmented, underground form. But these were isolated exceptions. The tragic reality is that the main body of the order, particularly in France, chose a path of surrender. This final, peaceful acceptance of annihilation remains one of the most poignant and debated moments in their history. Was it a failure of nerve at the most critical juncture? Or was it a final, tragic act of faith, a belief that even in the face of overwhelming injustice, a Christian knight did not raise his sword against the Church? By choosing not to fight, they averted a bloody civil war across Europe that they likely could not have won. But in doing so, they also ensured that their story, their true legacy of faith, finance, and military innovation, would be written by their victors, leaving behind 7 centuries of mystery and a haunting question of what might have happened if they had instead chosen to resist. Yet, even as their own legal protections crumbled, the Templars left behind a profound and unexpected legacy that would shape the modern world long after their dissolution. Through the sheer necessity of operating across a fractured and contentious medieval landscape, they became accidental pioneers of international law and diplomacy, crafting systems of exchange and negotiation that transcended the borders of kingdoms and faiths. Their unique position as a supranational entity forced them to develop a pragmatic code of conduct that looked beyond the simplistic divides of Christian versus Muslim, creating early frameworks for coexistence in a world obsessed with holy war. When a Templar commander sat down with an emir to negotiate a truce for safe passage of pilgrims, or to arrange a complex prisoner exchange, they were engaging in a form of realpolitik that was decades ahead of its time. These agreements, though often criticized by zealots in Europe, established crucial precedents. They demonstrated that even bitter enemies could be bound by mutually recognized rules of engagement, that a negotiated peace was sometimes more valuable than a Pyrrhic victory, and that the treatment of prisoners could be governed by protocols rather than pure brutality. This concept of a rules-based order between warring powers, however nascent, was a quiet revolution that would eventually influence the development of international law centuries later. Their revolutionary banking system, often discussed for its economic impact, was equally transformative in the realm of international relations. By creating a standardized system of contracts, letters of credit, and financial instruments that were honored from London to Jerusalem, the Templars effectively built a prototype for transnational commercial law. A merchant in Genoa could enter into a binding financial agreement with the order that would be enforceable in Acre, not because of a treaty between Italy and the Crusader states, but because of the Templars' own internal legal and administrative consistency. They functioned as a trusted third party, guaranteeing agreements between parties who had no other reason to trust each other, and in doing so, they created a de facto legal framework for international trade. Their meticulous record-keeping and insistence on written contracts helped move commerce away from informal handshake deals and toward a system based on documented, enforceable obligations. This introduced a level of predictability and security that was essential for the growth of an interconnected medieval economy, proving that trust could be institutionalized and that commerce could be a force for creating common legal ground across cultures. Perhaps their most significant contribution to the concept of diplomacy was their role as neutral intermediaries. The Templars' unique status, answerable directly to the Pope and operating outside the feudal hierarchy, made them the ideal mediators in disputes between Christian monarchs. They frequently carried sensitive messages between warring kings, brokered truces, and even held disputed territories in trust during negotiations. Their officials enjoyed a form of diplomatic immunity long before the term was formalized, their persons and communications considered inviolable as they moved between courts. This practice established a crucial principle that for diplomacy to function, there must be channels of communication that remain open even during conflict, and that certain individuals must be recognized as neutral actors. In a world where ambassadors were often seen as extensions of their master's will, and thus legitimate targets, the Templar model offered a glimpse of a more sophisticated system. They showed that international relations could be managed by professional, disinterested parties, a concept that would eventually evolve into the modern diplomatic corps. While the order itself was destroyed by the very nationalistic forces it sought to transcend, its inadvertent legacy lived on, providing a medieval blueprint for the complex, interconnected world of international law and diplomacy that would follow. Even as the last Templar strongholds fell and their order was formally dissolved, a remarkable phenomenon began to unfold. Their physical presence was erased, but their idea proved to be indestructible. The Templar model, a sworn brotherhood of elite initiates, bound by secret rituals and a higher purpose, was simply too potent to disappear. It was as if a blueprint for power had been released into the wild, and it was immediately seized upon and replicated by those who saw its potential. The most direct heirs were other military orders. The Teutonic Knights, originally founded as a field hospital during the siege of Acre, watched the Templars closely and ultimately adopted their structure almost wholesale, merging monastic discipline with martial fervor to carve out their own Crusader state in the Baltic. But the imitation didn't stop there. In Portugal, where the king had shrewdly protected the Templars from persecution, they were simply rebranded as the Order of Christ. This new entity inherited all the Templar assets, including their fleet, and would later play a pivotal role in the Age of Discovery, with the Templar cross even adorning the sails of Vasco da Gama's ships as they ventured into uncharted oceans. This tangible legacy, however, was just the beginning. As the centuries wore on and the Age of Enlightenment dawned, the Templars underwent a breathtaking metamorphosis. They were rediscovered not as historical bankers or warriors, but as romantic symbols. Their dramatic downfall, their rumored hidden knowledge, and their aura of persecuted innocence made them the perfect vessel for the anxieties and aspirations of a new era. Secret societies and fraternal orders that proliferated in the 17th and 18th centuries, most notably the Freemasons, eagerly incorporated Templar symbolism and myth into their own rituals. The Masons, who were building a philosophy based on reason, moral improvement, and the idea of a hidden guiding hand in history, found the Templar narrative irresistibly compelling. Here was a story of skilled builders and guardians of ancient wisdom, brought low by a tyrannical king and a corrupt church, a powerful allegory for their own struggles against oppressive monarchy and religious dogma. They adopted the image of the poor, persecuted knight as a central figure in their degree systems, and the legend of the murdered Grand Master Jacques de Molay became a potent symbol of martyrdom for liberty and truth. This cultural appropriation ensured the Templars achieved a form of immortality, but it came at a cost, a radical divorce from historical reality. The actual, documented Templars, the pragmatic bankers, the fierce warriors, the savvy diplomats, were gradually overwritten by a more exciting fictional version. They became blank slates upon which each new generation could project its own fantasies and fears. To some, they were the noble guardians of the Holy Grail or the Ark of the Covenant, secrets they had supposedly discovered beneath the Temple Mount. To others, they were heretics who possessed esoteric knowledge that threatened the very foundations of the Church. In the modern era, they have been cast as the protagonists of global conspiracy theories, the hidden masters pulling the strings of history from the shadows, their hand seen in everything from the founding of the United States to the design of the dollar bill. This enduring fascination speaks to a fundamental human desire for mystery and for stories that are larger than life. The Templars' greatest legacy, therefore, may not be in the castles they built or the banks they operated, but in the endless human capacity for myth-making. They made a decision, whether by accident or design, to shroud themselves in secrecy, and in doing so, they granted themselves a second life in the imagination of the world, a life far more expansive and enduring than their first. Long after the last Templar knight was laid to rest, their most enduring monuments refused to fade into history. They built not just for their own time, but for the ages, leaving behind a breathtaking architectural legacy that continues to shape the European landscape and captivate our imagination. Their structures were far more than simple shelters or fortifications. They were profound statements of faith, power, and a unique worldview carved in stone and mortar. Perhaps their most iconic contribution was the proliferation of round churches, a design directly inspired by the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. By replicating the rotunda of Christ's supposed tomb, they created a powerful spiritual link between Europe and the Holy Land. A pilgrim who could not make the perilous journey to Jerusalem could instead visit a Templar church in London, like the famous Temple Church, and experience a physical echo of that most sacred site. These round naves were not just symbolic, they were practical for their warrior monks, providing a continuous, unobstructed space perfect for processions, gatherings, and perhaps even the initiation rituals that would become so shrouded in mystery. But their architectural genius extended far beyond churches. Their preceptories, the administrative and economic hubs of their European network, were marvels of integrated design. These were not isolated monasteries but sprawling, multi-functional complexes that combined the sacred with the profoundly practical. A typical commandery would feature a church or chapel at its heart, surrounded by a dormitory for the brothers, a refectory for communal meals, a chapter house for meetings, and extensive utilitarian buildings, storerooms, stables, bakeries, breweries, and workshops. Many, like the immense preceptory of La Couvertoirade in France, were essentially self-sufficient fortified villages, encircled by formidable walls that could protect not only the knights but also the local population and their wealth in times of trouble. This blend of monastic serenity and military readiness was a physical manifestation of their dual identity, a daily reminder that they were men of both the cloister and the battlefield. The Templars were also masterful innovators in sacred geometry and symbolic language, embedding layers of meaning into their constructions. They employed the golden ratio and complex geometric patterns, believing that these perfect mathematical forms reflected the divine order of God's creation. This pursuit of geometric perfection would go on to heavily influence the development of Gothic architecture, with its soaring vaults and precise proportions. They also adorned their buildings with a rich tapestry of symbolic carvings, though often more restrained than the elaborate facades of public cathedrals. The ubiquitous image of two knights sharing a single horse, a symbol of their early poverty, could be found alongside lambs representing Christ, lions symbolizing resurrection, and of course, their distinctive cross. These motifs were a silent language, reinforcing their values and beliefs for the initiated brother, while projecting an image of piety and solidarity to the outside world. This architectural footprint ensured their survival in a way no papal bull or royal decree ever could. While the order itself was dissolved and its members scattered, their stone sentinels remained, stubbornly resistant to erasure. Today, these structures form a haunting and beautiful trail across Europe. You can stand in the echoing rotunda of the Temple Church in London, where the stone effigies of knights lie in eternal vigilance. You can walk the massive walls of Tama in Portugal, a castle that seamlessly transitioned from a Templar fortress to the headquarters of the Order of Christ. You can explore the atmospheric ruins of Château de Gizes in Normandy, or the perfectly preserved commandery of Saint Eulalie de Cernon in the south of France. Each site tells a story not of a sudden, dramatic end, but of a slow, persistent seepage into the fabric of history. They have been repurposed as barns, private homes, town halls, and museums, their original functions forgotten but their imposing presence undeniable. This physical legacy forces us to engage with the Templars on a tangible level, transforming them from shadowy figures in a history book into master builders whose ambition and devotion are still set in stone, a permanent and visible part of our shared cultural heritage. Perhaps unintentionally, the Knights Templar crafted the perfect recipe for immortality, not through their documented deeds, but through the tantalizing voids they left in the historical record. Their final, pivotal decision wasn't an action they took, but the collective consequence of their entire existence. A legacy so shrouded in mystery that it became a blank canvas for the world's imagination. Their potent combination of immense, unexplained wealth, a culture of severe secrecy, and a sudden, shocking downfall at the hands of a king and a pope created a vacuum. And nature, as it abhors a vacuum, rushed to fill it with speculation, legend, and outright fantasy. The very elements that made them powerful in life, their financial genius, their private rituals, their papal protections became, in their absence, the building blocks for every conspiracy theory that followed. The most enduring of these myths centers on the notion that during their excavations beneath the Temple Mount, they didn't just find room for stables, they discovered something that fundamentally altered their mission. The most popular theory, immortalized in everything from medieval Grail romances to modern blockbuster films, is that they found the Holy Grail itself, the cup used by Christ at the Last Supper. This single object would explain their sudden rise to prominence and wealth. They weren't just bankers but guardians of the ultimate Christian relic. Other legends suggest they found the lost treasures of King Solomon's temple, perhaps even the Ark of the Covenant, granting them not just material riches but unimaginable power. When Philip IV's men stormed the Paris temple and found the treasury empty, it wasn't seen as evidence that the order had been financially drained by years of war. Instead, it was proof positive to believers that the treasure had been secretly moved, hidden away in some remote location like Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland or a secret vault in the New World, waiting for the right time to be revealed. This narrative was powerfully weaponized by their accusers. The charges of idol worship, specifically of a mysterious head called Baphomet, were likely fabricated nonsense. But in the absence of any Templar records to definitively refute it, the idea took on a life of its own. Baphomet transformed from a probable mispronunciation of Muhammad into a demonic figure, a symbol of heretical knowledge and occult practices. Their secrecy around initiation rites, designed to ensure loyalty and operational security, was reinterpreted as evidence of dark rituals and blasphemous oaths. The lack of a clear, first-hand account of their inner workings meant that every accusation, no matter how outlandish, found fertile ground in which to grow. They became the ultimate scapegoats, a secret society onto which a fearful and superstitious world could project its anxieties about hidden power and spiritual corruption. This transformation from historical entity to cultural archetype accelerated in the 18th century with the rise of secret societies like the Freemasons. The Masons, seeking a noble and ancient lineage for their own fraternal order, eagerly adopted the Templars as their spiritual ancestors. They saw in the Templars' story a powerful allegory, a band of enlightened brothers, possessors of ancient wisdom, brought low by a tyrannical monarchy and a corrupt church. This romanticized version provided a perfect founding myth, full of martyrdom and hidden truth. The Masonic adoption of Templar symbols and degrees ensured that the knight story was kept alive, woven into the fabric of Western esoteric tradition, forever separating the legend from the far more complex and arguably more interesting historical reality. In the modern era, the Templar brand has become endlessly malleable, a go-to source for storytellers in every medium. They are the enigmatic villains in adventure video games, the noble questers in fantasy novels, and the shadowy puppeteers in sprawling conspiracy thrillers. Their name is invoked in theories connecting them to the founding of Switzerland, the design of the US dollar bill, and even the survival of a bloodline of Christ. This enduring fascination speaks to something deep within us, a love for a good mystery, an attraction to stories of tragic grandeur, and a suspicion that the true levers of power are always pulled behind a curtain. The historical Templars were pragmatic men, warriors, bankers, diplomats, but the legendary Templars have become something far greater, a symbol. They represent the eternal tension between faith and reason, the intoxicating allure of hidden knowledge, the corrupting nature of absolute power, and the peril of soaring too high in a world that is all too eager to clip your wings. Their greatest decision, then, was to be so extraordinary in life that the world simply refused to let them die. Their journey stands as a timeless parable of ambition and its consequences, a stark reminder that no institution, no matter how powerful or divinely sanctioned, is immune to the shifting sands of politics and the peril of its own blind spots. The Templars soared to unimaginable heights by mastering the delicate arts of innovation and influence, yet they ultimately fell because they failed to master the art of perception. They built an empire that transcended borders but forgot to nurture the relationships within those borders. They amassed wealth that could fund kingdoms but neglected the public goodwill that could have saved their own. They placed their faith in ancient privileges at the very moment the world was pivoting toward a new era of royal authority and nationalism. In the end, their story is a masterclass in the fact that strength is not just about wielding power, but about understanding the landscape in which that power exists. Their legacy, however, is far from a simple cautionary tale. It is woven into the very fabric of our modern world. Every time we use a line of credit, deposit a check, or rely on the principles of diplomatic immunity, we are engaging with systems that the Templars helped pioneer. Their architectural genius still dots the European landscape, their symbols still spark our imagination, and their dramatic narrative continues to inspire books, films, and games. They teach us that innovation can change the world, but also that success can breed envy, and that secrecy can foster suspicion. They show us that the most brilliant strategies are worthless if you cannot adapt to a changing world or see the threat emerging from within your own court. So as we close this chapter on these warrior monks, we are left not just with a history lesson, but with a mirror reflecting the eternal challenges of power, faith, and human nature. Thank you for exploring these 25 pivotal decisions with me. If this journey through Templar history resonated with you, please share your own thoughts in the comments below. What do you believe was their single greatest mistake? And if you want to join us for more deep dives into the mysteries of the past, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel.